Hello, hire. Hope you're all doing okay, ready for week two of remote learning, and I hope week one went okay. For some of you, I am your teacher normally, but for some of you, you might not know who I am, so I'm Mr. Shanks. I'm going to be doing your slides for the next few weeks while we're in remote learning. And today we're moving on to the next bit of the democracy course, so we're going to be looking at electoral systems. So if you want to, in your jotter, take a note of the title, which is electoral systems. Just pause the video until you've got that done. It's about to move on in a second to the next slide. So the aims for this bit of the course is we're going to understand first of all what the point of elections is in the first place. So why do we have these elections every few years? And then there's two different electoral systems that we're going to look at. So first past the post and the additional member system. And if you did National 5 Modern Studies, you'll already know a little bit about the additional member system. So that won't be completely new to you. And what we really need to try and do is we're looking to be able to evaluate basically how good each of these electoral systems is. So we're going to be looking mainly at the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. Today we're just going to focus on first past the post, and then you need to start thinking about how you can analyse the representativeness, if that's a word, which it isn't, of each of these electoral systems. Okay, so basically just how this is going to work. This is obviously a video, so you just listen along to the video, read what's on the screen. I'll tell you what you need to take down as notes, and I'll tell you at the end of going over those bits of notes so that you're not writing as I'm whittering on in the background. Just pause the video until you're ready to move on when you're taking down your notes. Okay? There are a couple of tasks throughout this, and I'll remind you of them at the end, so don't worry if there's a task halfway through the lesson. You don't need to do it there and then. Just keep going with the video till you've got all your notes, and then the tasks will be at the end. And you just submit those in whatever way you normally do with your own class teacher. Okay, so let's get started. Why do elections matter? Okay, now this might be a pretty obvious question, but the important thing to remember is we live in a representative democracy. So we don't directly get to choose the big decisions that affect us. We choose the people who go away and make all of these decisions on our behalf. They represent us. So a representative democracy. Not like the ancient Greek idea where everybody would troop down to the main square and put their hand up and say, I want this, or I don't want this, or I want the next thing. We don't get to do that very often. Sometimes we have referenda. So we had a referendum on Scottish independence, we had a referendum on Brexit. Those are direct democratic decisions, but normally our representatives decide everything for us. And so the only way we get to decide what they do is to vote in elections on whether we want them to stay in the job or whether we want other people to do it. So really, we know lots of different ways people can participate in politics. We've been studying that in the last few weeks. But the only way we can influence who makes those decisions for us is by voting. So elections are important. There's another aspect to this which is about legitimacy. Legitimacy is the idea that a government has some credibility. In other words, you can say they're making this decision because we voted for them. Okay? And so if a government's been democratically elected, it has a higher degree of legitimacy because people chose that government. So you could say it's a more legitimate government than a dictatorship, for example. So that's why elections matter. So just before we get started, there's some key terms here. Now, some of these might be really familiar to you already. Some of them might not be. I want you to copy down these key terms because if you don't know what these terms are, it's harder to then go through the rest of the lesson. So if you just listen to the brief explanation of them all and then pause the video at the end and copy down these key terms. The first one that's important to understand is majority government. Now, a majority is where you have more than half of something. So in the United Kingdom, we tend to get majority governments at Westminster quite a lot. So the Boris Johnson, the Conservative Party, has a majority government right now. In other words, out of the 650 seats in the House of Commons, Boris Johnson's party controls more than half of them. So he has a majority government. When we talk about seats, what we're meaning there is MPs. Okay, so MPs are what we mean by seats. So the opposite of majority government's a minority government. So this would be, for example, the SNP in the Scottish Parliament right now is a minority government. It has more seats than the other parties, but it doesn't have more than all the other parties put together. So the SNP currently is the biggest party in the Scottish Parliament, but if you added up all the other MSPs, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, Labour, the Conservatives, the Independents, they would have more. So it's a minority government. Okay, that's what Theresa May had from 2017 to 2019. She didn't have a majority, so she was a minority government. Coalition's an easy one. That's where parties work together to form the government. Now, this is really unusual in Britain, but actually very, very common around the rest of the world. Most countries in Europe have coalition governments all the time, but it's quite unusual because of the electoral system we use here. It's quite unusual in Britain. Opposition is the name that's given to the parties that aren't in power. The official opposition is the second biggest party in the UK Parliament, so that's the Labour Party just now. So Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, is the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, because they are the biggest party outside the one that's in government. So the opposition is just the party that oppose the government. They sit on the opposite benches in the House of Commons, the opposition benches. Marginal seats, these are seats that are won by a small amount, and they can easily switch. So seats where constituencies where maybe the party that won only won by a couple of hundred votes or a couple of thousand votes even, it means the next time around it's going to be quite easy to maybe change that constituency to a different political party. And safe seats are the opposite. So safe seats are constituencies where one party tends to always win, and they win by a big majority, so that actually it's very, very difficult to change the party there. It tends to stay exactly the same. So take a note of these key terms, pause the video now, and then I'll move on to the next bit. Okay, so electoral systems that we use in the UK. Now, confusingly, we don't vote the same way in every election. So there's elections every couple of years to your local council, like Renfrewshire Council, to the Scottish Parliament, to the UK Parliament, and until Brexit, we had elections to the European Parliament as well. And we vote differently in every single one of those elections. So for UK Parliament elections, we use a system called First Past the Post, FPTP. That's the one we're going to be talking about today. For Scottish Parliament elections, we use the Additional Member System, AMS, and that's one that you would have studied at National 5. It's the more complicated of the two systems to understand, but that's the system we use in Scotland. There's a third system called the Single Transferable Vote, STV, which is the most confusing of them all. We use that for council elections, but you don't need to worry about that one because we're only going to learn about two. You only need to compare two electoral systems, so we're just going to forget about single transferable vote for the moment. So, to try and understand the strengths and weaknesses of these two voting systems, we have to try and understand two competing ideas about how elections should work. And this is a big debate. There's no right or wrong answer on this. It's one of those things, if we were in class, I would be trying very hard to get you to argue with me about this, because everyone's entitled to a different opinion on this. One way of looking at it is that a political system the electoral system should aim to have a clear winner. So whatever else happens, at the end of the election, when all the votes are counted, somebody should be able to be declared the winner, and a strong government should then come out of that. Boris Johnson won the 2019 election. He emerged as Prime Minister. Nobody doubted that he was Prime Minister because he had won with an 80-odd seat majority. So he had won the election. And that then creates an accountable link between the voters and the government. Because if it was clear who was voted in, then it also means it's really clear who you blame if things don't go the way you want them to go. And also this link between voter and constituency. So for the UK Parliament, the whole country is divided into 650 wee bits called constituencies, We live in Renfrewshire North and Paisley. Each constituency's got roughly 65, 70,000 people in it. Some are bigger, some are smaller. This system makes sure there is a link between all of those people and one member of parliament who you know their name. You can turn up at their office if you don't like them. You can tell them what you think of them. There's a clear link between the two. So that's one way of looking at this political system. But there's another way as well. The other way is to think about it in a proportional way. So you're not exactly looking for a really clear winner from the election. You're looking to try and get as many people in Parliament to represent the views of the people in the country. So the way people vote should proportionately go to the number of MPs that then end up in Parliament. So percentage of votes should equal roughly, it's never perfect, but should equal roughly the percentage of seats. That might result in a lot more parties getting elected to Parliament, which could mean that you don't end up with a majority government, you end up with weak government. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? These are both two different legitimate views about voting systems that people disagree on all the time. You might have an opinion on this, you might not have an opinion right now, but it's important to understand these two ideas when we go into trying to think about which system is fairer. Okay. I have no idea if any of you are particularly into horse racing, but let's just follow this race on the screen just now. This was the 2 o'clock race at Ayr. You can see here number 3's coming up there just towards the final furlong and just manages to get across the line and is the winner. This is literally where first past the post comes from, is from horse racing. It doesn't matter who's ahead in 99.9% of the horse race. It only matters the horse that can get past that line first wins and takes home everything, wins the whole thing. Okay? That's first past the post in a nutshell. You just have to get one more vote than someone else in the election and you've won the whole thing. Okay? It doesn't matter if lots of people voted for loads of different parties. As long as you get more than the other person, you become the Member of Parliament. So, can you stick in your jot of the title first past the post? Okay, so what we're going to do is, there's quite a wee bit of writing with these next few slides, just so you've got all the information you need about first past the post. So, first past the post is used in the UK elections to elect members of Parliament to the UK Parliament. So all 650 members of Parliament are elected by first past the post. So in other words, they just need to win the most votes in each of those 650 constituencies across the country and they get elected to Parliament. It's also used as part of the additional member system, but to elect the constituency members of Parliament. Remember, there's 73 constituency MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. Don't worry too much about that bit because that might start to confuse you if we think about that. We'll come back to that later. This is a very simple voting system, and that's one of the real strengths of it. It's the reason a lot of people say we should keep first past the post, because all you have to do is you go in, you've got a list of candidates, a list of political parties, and you just put an X next to the party that you want, or next to the candidate that you want, although the name of the party is next to it as well. You put an X, you fold it up, you put it in the box, and off you go. It's very simple. Voters are not confused by this system, whereas they sometimes are by other voting systems. Then all that happens is 10 o'clock comes, voting stops, all the ballot boxes get collected together, they get counted up. Renfrewshire's, I think, are counted at Braehead Arena. They add up all the votes, and just the person who's got the most votes in that constituency wins. Even if they only win by 1 or 2 votes, they've won. They've got the most votes, so they become the Member of Parliament for that area. And all the other votes for all the different parties, they don't matter anymore. Okay, just the person who got the most. Under this system as well, you don't even need to get more than half the votes. You just need to get more than the next person. I'll show you an example in a second of why this matters. You do not need to get 50% of votes, and in fact, in quite a lot of constituencies across the UK, MPs get elected on 40%, 45% of the vote. In other words, most people voted for somebody else, but that person still got elected as a Member of Parliament. So, make sure you've taken down these notes, so pause now if you need to. Okay, so here's an example from our constituency. I'm assuming you all live in this constituency, but this is Paisley and Renfrewshire North, the constituency that Park Mains is in. Gavin Newlands there in his picture is your Member of Parliament. And you can see that he got 23,353 votes, which turned out to be 47% of all the people who voted. 47% of them voted for Gavin Newlands. Okay, now that's more than Alison Taylor from Labour got. She got 11,451 votes. Julie Perrone got 11,217 votes. Ross Stocker got 3,661 votes. So Gavin Newlands got quite a lot more, to be fair, than all the other candidates. He gets elected as the Member of Parliament. Okay, his majority is 11,902. What that means is 11,902 votes more than the next candidate. Okay, so if you take away Alison Taylor's 11,451 from Gavin Newlands, you get the majority, 11,902. Now, what that means in percentage terms is that less than half of the people who voted in the election in 2019 wanted Gavin Newlands to be their MP. But because he got more than the other people, he is the MP. So that means all the people who voted Labour, all the people who voted Conservative, all the people who voted Liberal Democrat, they don't get anything. The winner takes all. Okay, so Gavin Newlands is the Member of Parliament. Here's what the 2019 election looked like across the whole of the UK. Now there's two different pictures here. The one on the left is a kind of normal map of the UK divided up by all the constituencies. Now, because constituencies are decided by the number of people who live in them, not the physical size of them, what that means is you see a lot of blue and a lot of yellow and not very much red. And that's because Labour tends to win in cities, and cities tend to have lots and lots of people crammed into quite small areas. So if we look, for example, at Liverpool or at London, 12 million people live in London. Looks like nothing on that map, but actually Labour won almost all of those constituencies. Huge numbers of votes. Whereas if you look at Scotland, for example, you've got like Ross, Skye and Lochaber, a constituency up here that's maybe got about 35,000 people living in it. Huge area, but not very many people. And that voted SNP, but it looks huge on the map. So this map here on the right basically makes every single constituency the same size. Every single constituency is a hexagon. You can see London down here now has loads of red. Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, all these areas where Labour does quite well are red. And Scotland is much smaller there because the population is much smaller. Okay. So this is quite important, and you might want to come back to this slide when you're doing a task that I'm going to set you later on, but you can find this on the internet as well. First past the post has often been described as an unfair system in the sense that the number of votes don't always mean the number of seats that people actually get. So if we look at the 2019 election here, 43% of people, 43.6% of people voted Conservative, but the Conservatives ended up with 56% of the MPs. Labour ended up quite similar, so 32% of people voted Labour and 31% of the seats. So they ended up relatively proportional. But look at this, 11.5% of people voted Lib Dem. They ended up with only 6 members of Parliament, a tiny number of members of Parliament. The SNP went the opposite way actually, so they only got 4% of the vote, but they got 7.4% of the MPs. And that's because Scotland actually has more MPs than the number of people that live here, because we cover such a broad area. The Green Party, I'm not sure exactly what the proportion of the vote was they got, but they get lots and lots and lots of votes, but they only return 1 member of Parliament. Okay? And you can see the similar thing happens in the 2015 election and the 2017 election. So you might want to come back to this slide later. So is first past the post fair? This is a kind of silly example, but this is from Belfast South. Now, Northern Irish politics is quite complicated. But you can see here, for example, the SDLP Member of Parliament, Alistair MacDonald, got 9,560 votes, so he got more than any of the other candidates, so he got elected as the Member of Parliament. But he actually, if you look at the percentage, he got less than a quarter of the votes. So in other words, 3/4 of the people living in Belfast South didn't want him to be the Member of Parliament, but he still got elected under first past the post. So this is why people think this system might actually not be very fair. So, okay, so strengths of first past the post, first of all, if you just put the title, strengths of first past the post. And the first one is it encourages stable government and usually, although not always, but usually an outright winner. So first past the post favours two large parties, Labour and the Conservatives, and it tends to give them an overall majority of seats. So over the decades, it's gone between Labour and the Conservatives, Labour and the Conservatives. There hasn't been a Prime Minister in a very, very long time who hasn't come from one of those political parties. With a large majority, the government can pass legislation based on the policies that people voted for. So if people knew what they were voting for, they know what they're going to then get. And for example, since 1945, only 3 elections have ever resulted in a hung parliament. A hung parliament is where no party has overall control. Okay? 2 of those have happened in the last 20 years. Most recently in 2017 when Theresa May didn't have a majority. So that's your first strengths of first past the post. Pause now. Okay, second strength of first past the post is that it does give a strong relationship between the constituent and their representative. So between you and your Member of Parliament. You know who your Member of Parliament is, it's Gavin Newlands. You know you can go and see them about particular problems. So constituents tend to like that. They know who's responsible. It also increases accountability because if you know that one person is your MP, you can hold them accountable for what they say they're going to do. And if they're not doing a good job, you can get rid of them. So, for example, during the expenses scandal, when lots of MPs were pulled up for spending the public's money on things they shouldn't have been spending it on, people knew their MPs, whether they'd been involved in that or not, and they could vote them out if they didn't like them. Dennis Skinner is quite a famous Labour MP, well, not anymore, he lost his seat in 2019, but he had been an MP for 50 years. And he lost his seat to the Conservatives because voters were unhappy with Labour. So there's a direct relationship there between the constituents and who they want to represent them. Okay, your third strength tends to be quite good at keeping extreme parties from getting into Parliament. There's different definitions of extreme parties, but because you've got to get more votes than any other candidate to win, tends to mean it's actually quite difficult to get into Parliament if you don't have broad support. So if we think about real extremist parties like the British National Party, which you don't really hear about anymore because they failed to ever get elected to Parliament. So extreme racist, xenophobic parties tend not to get elected. UKIP we wouldn't put in the same category as the BNP, but it does have some quite extreme views on immigration and things like that. They were doing really well in opinion polls in the run up to the 2015 election, but they only got 8% of the votes and they only got 1 constituency. Whereas under a more proportional system, they actually ended up getting 23 MEPs, which was more than Labour and the Conservatives. So you've got to be careful. If we look at countries like France, they have parties like the National Front, which are extremely racist, get elected to Parliament because of proportional systems of voting. So it tends to keep extremist parties from getting into Parliament. Okay, so on to weaknesses of first past the post now. So if you put that as your title. And the first one is, doesn't always produce strong majority governments. Now, you might think, why is that a weakness of first past the post? Because people don't expect coalitions. They go into the voting booth expecting to get what they voted for. Then when it does happen, people think that's unfair. So for example, in 2010, nobody voted for a coalition and nobody expected a coalition. So it seems unfair that then the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives changed a lot of their policies. For example, the Liberal Democrats were against tuition fees. They went into a coalition and they ended up introducing tuition fees. People think that that's unfair. In 2017, we had a slightly different situation because there wasn't a coalition, but there was a kind of unofficial coalition with the Democratic Unionist Party from Northern Ireland, the DUP. The Conservatives used MPs from the DUP to make sure they could get their votes through Parliament, and that seemed unfair to a lot of people because nobody outside of Northern Ireland could ever vote for the DUP. So that's weakness number one. Okay, weakness number two is the biggest one of all, is that it's not proportional. When we say proportional, what we mean is the number of MPs should roughly match up with the number of votes that you get. Maybe not exactly, but close to. And first past the post definitely does not result in that. So it means that some parties can only get a small number of votes but end up with a lot of the seats. And a lot of parties can do the opposite. They can get lots and lots of votes, but because it's spread out across the whole country, they get very few seats. The Green Party is a very good example of that. A party that gets not huge levels of support, but gets quite good levels of support all across the country, but not enough to ever win. They win one constituency in Brighton, where they have managed to get enough votes. Many people think that this is undemocratic. The last point, what I want you to do there is leave a bit of a gap for your example, because I'm going to set you a task at the end that I want you to go back to and fill in that gap. So don't write leave a gap, you'll fill this, just leave a gap, okay? Don't write that in your notes. Just write example and then leave a couple of lines. And then pause here if you need to write this down. Okay, weakness number three is the problem of safe seats. Now, safe seats, if you remember from the definitions, are basically constituencies where the same party wins over and over and over and over again. And people who live in safe constituencies might think, what is the point in going out to vote because they're going to win anyway? The other thing with that is people tend to not campaign as much in those constituencies, because if you live in a constituency in Liverpool, for example, that always votes Labour, why would the Conservatives bother spending time campaigning there? Because they know that Labour's going to win anyway. So it means voters get kind of disenfranchised from the process. So some examples there: Labour won Liverpool-Walton with 75% of the vote. That's the highest majority of any constituency in the country. And there was a piece of research done just last year that found that 54 constituencies that have Conservative MPs haven't ever voted for anyone else since the Second World War. And some of those have been more than a century where they've only ever voted Conservative. So if you happen to live in one of those places and you don't like the Conservatives, tough. You've got no option. You've just got to go along with it. And again, people might think that's undemocratic. However, back to Dennis Skinner, the MP from Bolsover until the last election, doesn't always happen. Dennis Skinner had a massive majority in his constituency and he still lost it to the Conservatives. So it doesn't always stay the same. And the fourth weakness, the final weakness of first past the post, is that the system is kind of set up so that Labour and the Conservatives will always become the party of government. And that leads to apathy. Apathy is the idea that you're just not interested in taking part anymore. Puts people off voting. It also creates what's called in the slides here electoral deserts, where basically a party might not have a lot of support, but it doesn't matter because they've got a lot of support somewhere else. So the Conservatives, for example, don't tend to win that many constituencies in Scotland, but they win lots of constituencies in England, and that's enough for them to win, for them to become the party of government. The opposite works as well. In 2019, Labour got nearly 20% of the vote in Scotland, but they only got one member of Parliament, because their vote was spread out across the whole of Scotland, and the SNP won most of the constituencies in Scotland. Okay, so that's me finished just at half an hour, which is what I was aiming for. going through all the slides there, your tasks are basically make sure you've got all your notes. If you can imagine we were in class writing down these notes, we're just doing it as a video because we're not in class. So make sure you have got all of these notes from this lesson. If you go back to the first past the post bit where I told you to leave a little gap, what I want you to do is try and Google statistics on votes versus seats. And there's loads of websites that will be able to help you out with this. Find a reputable website like the BBC or the Parliament itself has a website on this, and find statistics from 2019. Don't use stuff from before, because 2019 is our most recent example. So examples of places where, or parties that got lots of votes and not very many seats, or lots of seats and not very many votes, and fill in your gap there with some examples. And then the last task I want you to work on is to have a go at a 12-mark question. For this question, you only need to know one voting system. You only know one voting system so far, which is first past the post. The question is, evaluate the effectiveness of one voting system you've studied in providing fair representation. So this kind of question is asking you to evaluate how effective a voting system is at being fair. So you're going to look here at, you want some arguments for why it is fair, and some arguments for why it isn't fair, and your examples as well. You might need to look up some more examples for this, but you should have enough in the slides to get you started with that. Okay, so that's your tasks for today and tomorrow. Well, for the whole week, but on Wednesday we'll give you the second part of this lesson, which is looking at the additional member system. And then you've got the whole week to work on all of the notes. So take whatever time you need. You don't need to do it all today, obviously, but try and get this done by Friday and submit it in whatever way your own class teacher normally asks you to do it. Thank you very much for joining the class today. I hope that this way of doing the lesson works okay, but if you've got feedback on it at all, if I'm talking too fast or talking too slow or talking too much, please do give some feedback to your teacher and I'll get that from them. But in the meantime, have a really good week, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon. Thanks very much.